Hello, and welcome to Full Course Winner. I'm Brian, and our first game review is Bioshock Infinite. The third in the Bioshock series from Irrational Games by Ken Levine, Infinite leaves the Eve-addled waters of Rapture and ventures into the racist clouds of Columbia. It's a linear, single-player FPS which trades in the Ayn Rand and pipe puzzles of its predecessors for an emphasis on prejudice and metaphysics, along with saving a princess, rail shooting, and copious amounts of ultra-violence. It's definitely a game you should play. Following a release that was delayed by almost half a year, Bioshock Infinite was received excellently by gamers and lauded for the depth of its story. Unlike the first two titles in the series, you are
Booker DeWitt,
a desperate man who is tasked to
and wipe away the debt.
all because
I gambled, and now I owe money to men you don't want to be in debt to.
his jaded demeanor is a stark contrast to the previous entries in the series, where you played as the always-in-demand, unnamed, silent protagonist. It's a good change in my opinion, even if it does occasionally create a dichotomy with the player's actions. Following a not entirely brief adjustment period, we finally get around to meeting the female protagonist, Elizabeth. She is a naive but resourceful young woman of a powerful lineage that possesses a rare power and is locked in an impregnable tower guarded by a terrifying flying monster. She is the princess this time around, but ultimately proves herself to be the second half of our combat mechanics. That power I mentioned, she opens up tears in reality, metaphysics. During fights or major events, she can realize quantum probabilities, which means summoning objects from alternate realities like cover, supplies, environmentals, and robots. That's right, instead of solving a pipe game to hack turrets this time, we can instead get Elizabeth to summon them in when the terror is available, or use the possession ability to control hostile automatons. The result is a much more active, but temporary, effect compared to the hacking in the earlier games. Even outside of fights, Elizabeth would wander around areas to scrounge up change or point out lockpicks. Only she can use lockpicks, though, so I'm not sure why I had to hold on to them for her. Regardless, this ties Elizabeth to us on a mechanical level, further strengthening her importance as a character. Of course, her freedom incurs the wrath of Father Comstock, who is the Mad King to Elizabeth's princess. As the main antagonist, the local cult of personality revolves around him, in case the massive statue of him at the beginning wasn't clear. Where Lutece provided the means of Columbia staying suspended through applied quantum physics, and Fink provided the infrastructure of industry, Comstock provided charisma, informed by the kind of patriarchal prejudice you expect from someone willing to build a floating city as a middle finger to Abraham Lincoln. No surprise, then, that during the duo's jaunt across Columbia, one of the main themes they'll be dealing with is racism. The ambiance, from NPC dialogue to set design, seems to brim with folksy, political comic levels of prejudice. While it's certainly most overt about racism towards Black, Asian, and Native Americans, you'll come across prejudice towards the Irish, Protestants, Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews as well. So much so that when the Vox Populi revolution kicks off, I don't really feel for their plight. All things considered, it's no surprise that folks like Daisy and the Vox Populi led a bloody revolt against them, though I suppose the constant reality warping could have had some influence. Disappointingly enough.
When it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell the name.
So on top of Comstock's constables, the Vox Populi also end up gunning for us every chance they get. Come to think of it, for all its deep topics and character development, the player's role here is largely as Booker's id. It's through our control that he raids garbage cans and people's belongings for food like a ravenous hobo, and it's our control that guides him through the carnage awaiting between beginning and conclusion. Personally, my approach was very Salt-focused. Powers are what originally drew me to Bioshock, along with its retro style, and this time around they're fueled by Salt, as opposed to Eve, or Mana, or MP, or Gatorade Arctic Chill. I was glad to see the detail they put into the effect that the powers had on the hand, and while I still miss the bees, the crows do the job admirably. I got a lot of utility out of the powers, especially since we can switch between any of our accumulated powers on the fly, but there was definitely one thing they lacked: presence in the culture. Despite all the vending machines and advertisements, Infinite glosses over the background of Salt and focuses instead on quantum mechanics. In fact, Booker is the only one besides firemen and a few bosses that seem to use salts. It made me recall the splices of previous Bioshocks, and the truth is, I missed the powered-up junkies. Use of Eve felt more present in the environment then, too, and was woven into the backstory, which gave the usual power at a cost lesson more discernible gravitas when faced with a splicer or the fate of a little sister. It felt good, though, since it wasn't that you having the powers made you strong, but that you were able to control them better than the others who had succumbed. As for the other half of our arsenal, the weapons themselves felt too piecemeal for me to invest in. Despite weapon upgrades being cheaper, we needed to buy upgrades separately for the Constable and Vox versions of similar weapons. Considering how often I had to scavenge for weapons, I usually opted to just save money up for power upgrades instead. Combat is accentuated, though, by the clothing we pick up, though it's not really clear at first how you're supposed to switch between them. Some are specific to rails, others to powers or weapons, but it's a shame we can't see how we actually look in it. Much like the powers, it accounts for a lot of depth in combat, but lacks some visibility. As for the skyhook, I had a lot of fun with it, zipping around, opening tears on a whim, while crank gunning gangs of enemies. I actually depended on it a lot, and had a lot more trouble with boss fights when I couldn't rely on it for a quick getaway. I'm looking at you, Lady Comstock. As we approach the end of our game, though, the challenge of shooting hordes of NPCs gives way to the challenge of keeping the logic straight. Remember how I mentioned that prejudice was one of the game's main themes? Well, the other one is quantum mechanics, specifically the many worlds theory. It is this game's deus ex machina, and it's used to explain how Columbia stays afloat, how Elizabeth's powers work, and anything else that would have once been attributed to magic or some form of radiation. For all the implications it has regarding the importance of choices, the message falls apart for me at the end. While I get that Booker is nobly sacrificing himself here, I can't help but feel confused and dissatisfied. Any way I look at it, it lessens the impact of the game in some way. For instance, let's say drowning works. Not only have you eliminated Comstock, but Booker and Elizabeth as well, as all the actions you took in the game. Doesn't that mean your entire experience has amounted to nothing? I feel like this is 2 steps removed from the "it was all a dream," but I'm a completionist, so maybe it just bothers me more. Is it truly heroic to smother oneself to remove the bad possibilities, even if it does mean removing the good ones too? I don't know. But if that isn't the case, it's at odds with the many worlds theory. If Booker had to make the choice to go through with the drowning, this necessarily means another branch exists where he doesn't, right? Hence, there still exists possible realities where Booker, Elizabeth, and Comstock still exist, making this one drowning scene moot in the grand scheme of things since it doesn't really stop it. My point is, it either ends up being pointless or a temporal paradox, yet it still bothered me less than that because of all of its focus on probabilities and choices. Choices themselves felt rarely embraced mechanically. Compared to the first Bioshock that let you choose how you harvested Adam from the Little Sisters, and the second which let you choose how you ultimately dealt with the bosses, Infinite's linear nature pays lip service to choice, which is my biggest disappointment with the game. Even so, Bioshock Infinite is worth buying. It doesn't quite surpass the original for me, but I admire it for taking steps in a new direction in terms of philosophy and character development, even if I am still left asking in the end.
Will the circle